Hey, everybody, let's talk for a minute about the term provider. What's in a name? Over my nearly 30 years as a nurse practitioner, I've been called a lot of things. Probably one of the most benign is the word provider. Now, I've listened to the moans of my physician colleagues who often recoil when being called a provider. Physicians believe that being called a provider diminishes their role in healthcare and it affects the relationship that they believe should exist between them and their patients. Just a few years ago, I began hearing a lot of talk from my colleagues about physician journals that were claiming that the term provider originated in Nazi Germany as a derogatory way to refer to Jewish physicians. I decided to finally sit down and take a look at just how this term provider evolved. So here's what I've learned so far. Leaving Nazi Germany aside for the moment, the term provider first appeared in the mid-1960s with the passage of Title 19 of the Social Security Act and the creation of Medicare and Medicaid. It was the result of the realities of third-party insurance and its associated regulations. Providers at that time referred to hospitals, extended care facilities, and home health care agencies, but quickly expanded to include healthcare professionals, or just about anyone in healthcare who received third-party payment. In the early 1970s, there was a movement by patient activists to push the concept of patient as consumer. Historian Nancy Tomes tells us that the patient-consumer movement was the result of medical paternalism and an unresponsive medical establishment. Now, if you're old enough to remember TV shows like Marcus Welby, MD, or Medical Center, or even Emergency, physicians were always wearing the white coat, and without question, they were in charge. In fact, it was common for nurses to stand when a doctor entered the room, whether it be in the break room or the nurse's station. Obviously, we're far removed from those days, thankfully. Patients were likewise in awe when the physician entered the room. They should never question their doctor's orders. As the culture of the late 60s and early 70s changed, so did some of the idolization of physicians. Patients expected their physician to include them in decision making, and patients wanted to be treated as a customer more and more. Thus, the advent of the patient as consumer movement. There were some changes that did result from this. Small-scale reforms occurred, but probably the best-known result of that movement was the adoption of the Patient Bill of Rights that started to appear near every hospital elevator in the early 1980s. Some argue that small gains that were achieved by the patient rights movement really prevented a wholesale overhaul in the healthcare system. What persisted was the idea that the patient was the consumer and the physician was the provider. Now, I'll briefly discuss the question of whether the Nazis were the first to use the title provider for physicians. So in the late 1930s, Jewish physicians had their licenses to practice medicine altered or removed and were limited to treating only Jewish patients. They were given the title Behandler or Krankenbehandler. And here's where it gets confusing. In the literature written about the topic, especially from experts in German language studies, there's no clear translation of the word Behandler or Krankenbehandler to English. Different interpretations exist, from treater of the sick, health practitioner, practitioner of the sick, and so on. But all experts seem to agree that there's no direct translation to provider. So it seems that there's no direct connection between the Nazi Party and calling any healthcare professional a provider. Sorry about that. But I believe when I first heard it, I did. I believed it. But I can't find any concrete evidence that Hitler's responsible for physicians being called providers today. Now, I have to break for a minute and talk about a similar ambiguous term that I remember being drilled into my head in the late 80s, and that was the client. I know this is a little off topic, but I have to mention it. Nursing thought leaders back then believed that nurses had to embrace the idea that the patient was in fact a client of the nurse. Some of us, me included, never ever accepted it. Well, on paper, I probably did, because every paper and care plan that I wrote in school and beyond had to cater to whatever activist professor I was working under, and many of them just loved the term client instead of patient. Of course, 99% of those professors never cared for or treated a live patient, but I'll leave it there for now. But it might be worth revisiting in another video. Of course, as physician assistants and nurse practitioners began to appear more often in healthcare, they were also considered providers. It seems like provider these days refers to anyone who provides care, whether they be physicians, dental hygienists, therapists, and so on. So where does the term provider really come from? It seems it was a term bestowed upon all healthcare professionals by the insurance industry. The reason? My opinion is this. It was a great way to lump us all into one basket, to remind us all, big and small, that we were considered one gigantic tool of the insurance industry. It didn't matter what your license was. In the eyes of insurance, you're a tool that must be worked with in order to facilitate that transfer of money. Ironically, I recall back when it seemed most insurance companies were run by physicians. Most of their boards were dominated by physicians. One of my early jobs involved working for a physician who owned 2 large medical centers, a nursing home, several hotels, pharmacies, and a health insurance company. He also owned a strip club and a few other non-medical revenue streams. But as much as some physicians object to being called provider, it's just an example of how their predecessors might have had something to do with it. Personally, I get it. I understand. I think that the word provider is too broad, and I can understand how a physician who has put years towards education cannot accept being called simply a provider. After all, we're all sensitive to how we're perceived in society, and physicians, whether you agree or disagree, have at least up until COVID been held in pretty high regard by the public. Not as high as nurses, who year after year are considered more trusted and ethical than all other professions, but medical doctors are still usually in the top 5. What I think should happen is a more common sense way of getting around this term provider. Physicians should be called physicians, not providers, and not doctors either. NPs and PAs should be addressed by their license, not the blanket term APP or advanced practice provider. Although, to be honest, I don't really object to the acronym APP. At least it's a pretty good descriptor of what we are and what we do. I think it's better than provider. So tell me what you think. Do you call your NP, your PA, or your physician a provider? Do you believe that the term is too general, too nonspecific? Do you think that provider diminishes the role? Or do you not really care one way or the other? Anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll meet on the next video.